One expert sniff told me my daughter-in-law's $800 gift was a liquid death sentence. I didn't call the police. I started a cold clinical game of revenge that stripped her life away one lie at a time. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The wine bottle sat on my kitchen counter like a live grenade, its expensive label mocking the cheap way it had been handled. My daughter-in-law, Venera, had handed it to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, but my thumb had already found the truth. The wax seal was jagged, the foil cap creased by amateur fingers, and the cork underneath sat a fraction of an inch too low. In 35 years as a sommelier, I had never seen a vintage bottle of that caliber look so violated. I knew right then that this wasn't a gift, it was a trap, and the people I loved were the ones pulling the pin. "Harrison, you have to try it soon," Venera had said, her voice thin and brittle as glass. "Dwight insisted we bring it back from France just for you." My son Dwight hadn't looked at me once during the entire dinner. He had kept his eyes glued to his phone, his thumb scrolling through nothing, while his wife did all the talking. They had stayed for exactly 2 hours, long enough to drop off the poison and short enough to avoid any real questions. Now, standing alone in my quiet house, I picked up the bottle of 1995 Chateau Margaux. It was an $800 bottle of wine, a masterpiece of Bordeaux, but the pressure marks on the capsule told a different story. Someone had opened this, tampered with it, and forced the cork back down with a blunt instrument. I walked to my workbench in the wine cellar, the cool air settling over my shoulders like a shroud. Under the magnifying lamp, the evidence screamed. Tiny flecks of white residue clung to the underside of the foil. I didn't need a lab to know that fine wine doesn't come with a side of crystalline powder. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Dwight that arrived 3 minutes after they pulled out of the driveway. "Glad we could swing by, Dad," the message read. "Venera loved seeing you. Enjoy the wine this weekend. It doesn't get any better than that." I stared at the thumbs-up emoji at the end of the text. 6 months of silence, 6 months of unanswered calls and ignored invites, all leading up to this urgent request for me to drink a tampered bottle. I pulled up my banking app and looked at the trust fund I had set up for Dwight, the one he couldn't touch until I passed or turned 70. It was a significant sum, enough to clear any debt a failing startup could accrue. My chest tightened, a sharp sensory jolt that had nothing to do with my heart health and everything to do with betrayal. I grabbed my car keys and the bottle, wrapping it in a plain dish towel. I couldn't stay in this house, not with the walls closing in and the air smelling like suspicion. I drove through the dark streets of Lake Oswego, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I needed to know if I was crazy or if my son was actually trying to kill me. I pulled into Gretel's driveway, the tires crunching on gravel. Gretel was Venera's mother, a woman who had worked 3 jobs to put her daughter through school, a woman who had been my friend for 20 years. "Harrison?" "It's nearly 10 at night," Gretel said, opening the door in her bathrobe. "Is everything okay?" I held out the wrapped bottle, my hand steady despite the roar in my ears. "I wanted to give you this. A thank you for helping me with the roof last week. It's a Margaux, very special." Her face lit up, a genuine warmth that made the bile rise in my throat. "Oh, Harrison, you don't have to do that. That looks expensive," I insisted, my voice a practiced mask of sommelier calm. "Just promise me you won't open it tonight. Save it for a special occasion, maybe Sunday." She hugged me, the smell of lavender and laundry detergent grounding me for a split second. "You're too good to us," she whispered. I thanked her and walked back to my car, the weight of what I had just done pressing into my lungs. I wasn't just testing the wine anymore. I was moving the pieces on a board I didn't fully understand. I drove home and sat in my dark kitchen waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the next move in a game that had already cost me my peace of mind. The ringer went off at midnight, an unknown number flashing on the screen. I answered on the first vibration. "You shouldn't have given the bottle away, Harrison," a man's voice said, low and distorted. "Now the wrong person is going to pay the price." I slammed the phone down, my breath coming in shallow hitches that rattled my ribs. The voice had been cold, clinical, and entirely too familiar with my movements. I looked out my kitchen window at the shadows stretching across the lawn, wondering which one was watching me. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a target. I moved to my office and pulled a digital recorder from the desk drawer, the red light blinking like a warning. If they were going to play this game, I was going to document every single move. I dialed Venera, my fingers flying across the keypad. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice thick with fake sleepiness. "Harrison, is everything okay?" "It's so late." "Venera, I have a problem," I said, leaning into the microphone of the recorder. I gave the wine away. I felt so bad about Gretel helping me with the house that I stopped by and dropped it off. "I thought you should know." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. I heard a muffled thud like a phone hitting a mattress, and then a sharp, strangled intake of breath. "You did what?" Venera screamed, her voice losing all its polished edges. "You gave it to my mother. Harrison, you ruined everything." Her voice trembled with a horror so raw it sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the sound of a disappointed gift giver. It was the sound of a killer who had just realized the bullet hit the wrong person. In the background, I heard Dwight shouting, asking what was happening, and then the line went dead. I sat in the dark, the recording of her confession looping in my head. "You ruined everything." Those 4 words were the verdict. They hadn't brought me wine. They had brought me a death sentence. I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night at my computer, my eyes burning as I navigated the dark corners of the wine world I usually avoided. I looked up counterfeit bottles, tampered seals, and the specific chemical tells of illicit additives. My thumb traced the screen as I found a thread on a private forum about cardiac glycosides, poisons that could be slipped into red wine to mimic a natural heart attack. In a man my age, the ER wouldn't even blink. They would just sign the certificate and move on to the next case. At 6 a.m., I was at the door of an old friend, Alonzo Mitchell. He ran a toxicology lab that handled high-stakes fraud for the major auction houses. He looked at me, then at the dish towel I was holding, and gestured me inside without a word. "Harry, you look like you've seen a ghost," Alonzo said, setting a pot of coffee on the burner. "I need you to test some wine," I told him, placing a small vial on the stainless steel counter. I had siphoned a few drops from the Margot before I gave it to Gretel. "Just tell me what's in it. And Alonzo, keep this off the books." He nodded, his eyes lingering on the vial. "Give me 3 hours. Go get some breakfast. I couldn't eat." I drove to a park near the waterfront and watched the rowers on the river, their rhythmic movements a stark contrast to the chaos in my chest. My phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Dwight's car parked outside a check cashing business on 82nd Avenue. Fast Cash, the sign read in neon green. Below the photo was a single line of text. "Your son owes $50,000 to people who don't take IOUs." The pieces were clicking together like a loaded magazine. The debt, the urgent gift, the poisoned wine. Dwight was drowning, and he had decided that my life was the only thing buoyant enough to save him. I felt a flash of white-hot anger, the kind that burns away fear and leaves only a sharp, cold clarity. I wasn't just an old man with a cellar full of dusty bottles. I was a man who knew how to authenticate the truth, and I was going to strip their lies away until there was nothing left but the bone. I headed back to Alonzo's lab, my heart hammering against my teeth. He was standing by the centrifuge, a printed report in his hand. He didn't look up when I walked in. "Harry, this isn't just a bad batch of grapes," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's oleander extract and arsenic trioxide. It's a precision dose. It wouldn't kill you instantly. It would make you sick, send you into an arrhythmia, and then..." "And then what?" I asked, my voice steady. "And then they would use the antidote," Alonzo said, pointing to a line on the report. "Digoxin immune fab. It's a prescription-only reversal agent. If they had that on hand, they could save you right before your heart gave out. You'd wake up in the hospital, grateful to whoever found you." I exhaled like surf, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. They didn't want me dead. They wanted me indebted. They wanted to be the heroes who saved me, the ones I would reward by opening my checkbook and handing over my house. It was a long con murder. I grabbed the report and walked out, my mind already spinning with the next move. I had the evidence, I had the motive, and now I had the location of the man holding my son's leash. I drove toward 82nd Avenue, the world narrowing to a single target. I was going to find the man named Von Carter, and I was going to buy my son's debt with the only currency I had left, the truth. I parked a block away from the check-cashing place, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I saw a man standing by the entrance, heavy-set with a suit that cost more than the building. He was talking to Dwight, who looked like he was about to vomit. I stayed in the car. My phone camera zoomed in on the exchange. I took 10 photos in 10 seconds, documenting the moment my son sold his soul. I was about to pull away when my phone rang again. It was Gretel. Her voice was trembling, the sound of a woman who had just stared into the abyss. "Harrison," I opened the bottle. She sobbed. I didn't drink it, but I smelled it. It smelled like almonds and bitter herbs. And then Venera showed up. "She's here, Harrison. She's trying to take the bottle away from me." I floored the accelerator, the engine of my sedan roaring as I pulled a U-turn that sent gravel spraying against the side of the check-cashing office. I didn't care about stealth anymore. I didn't care about the long game. Gretel was in danger, and my daughter-in-law was the one holding the match. I wove through traffic, my pulse spiking with every red light I bypassed. If Venera hurt her own mother to cover her tracks, there would be no coming back for any of us. I arrived at Gretel's house in 12 minutes, my tires screeching as I fishtailed into the driveway. I didn't even turn off the engine. I threw the door open and sprinted up the porch steps, the sound of shouting coming through the screen door. "Give it to me, Mom," Venera was screaming. "You don't understand." "It's spoiled. I have to take it back." I burst through the door, my chest heaving. "Get away from her, Venera." The room went thinner than air. Venera was standing in the middle of the kitchen, her hands wrapped around the neck of the Margot bottle, her face a mask of desperation. Gretel was backed against the sink, her eyes wide and wet, a spilled glass of red wine staining the white linoleum like a bloodbath. Venera spun around to face me, the bottle trembling in her grip. "Harrison, you shouldn't be here," she hissed, her eyes darting toward the door. I moved into the kitchen, my boots clicking on the tile. "Put the bottle down. I know what's in it. I know about the oleander. I know about the arsenic. And I know about the $50,000 Dwight owes Von Carter." Venera went pale, the color draining from her face until she looked like a wax figure. The bottle slipped an inch in her hand, her knuckles white. Gretel let out a strangled sob, her hand flying to her mouth. "Harrison, what are you saying?" Gretel whispered. "My daughter—" She wouldn't. "She did," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "They wanted me sick, Gretel. They wanted me to be so grateful they saved me that I'd hand over the keys to the kingdom. But they miscalculated. They forgot I've been tasting poison and lies for 35 years. Venera lunged for the back door, but I was faster. I grabbed her arm, the force of the movement sending the bottle flying. It hit the floor with a sickening thud, but it didn't break. The thick glass held, the dark liquid inside sloshing against the tampered cork. I pinned her against the counter, my anger finally boiling over. "Is this what your father taught you?" I growled, my face inches from hers. "Is this the family legacy?" "Harrison, please," she whimpered, her strength vanishing. "We were going to save you. We had the medicine. You would have been fine. We just needed the money." Gretel collapsed into a kitchen chair, her face buried in her hands. The room was silent except for the sound of Venera's heavy, panicked breathing. I let go of her arm, stepping back with a sense of profound disgust. I looked at the woman I had welcomed into my family, the woman I had toasted at her wedding, and all I saw was a predator who had run out of room to hide. I picked up the bottle from the floor, wrapping it back in the dish towel. "I'm taking this," I told her, "and I'm taking the recording of our phone call and the toxicology report." Venera looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You won't go to the police. It would destroy Dwight. You love him too much." "You're right," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "I won't go to the police. Not yet. I have a much better plan for Dwight." I walked out of the house, leaving Venera standing in the wreckage of her own scheme. I drove back to my place, my mind already drafting the blog post that would change everything. I was one of the most respected voices in the Pacific Northwest wine community. My blog had 3,000 subscribers, including every major collector and distributor in the region. If I published an analysis of a counterfeit tampered bottle of 1995 Margaux, the ripples would turn into a tsunami. I spent the next 3 hours writing. I didn't name names, but I provided the lot number, the specific creasing on the foil, and the chemical composition of the additives. I described the exact pressure marks on the cork. I made it clinical, professional, and devastating. Anyone who had seen that bottle in Dwight's hands would know exactly who I was talking about. I scheduled the post for 6 a.m. the next morning. Then, I opened my laptop and navigated to a shell company I had set up years ago for my own private investments. I sent a wire for $60,000 to an account linked to Von Carter's business. It was the principal plus a 20% fee for the convenience. The phone buzzed 10 minutes later. It was Von Carter. "The debt is cleared, Parker," he said. "Your boy is off the hook. But I have a feeling you didn't do this out of the goodness of your heart." "I didn't," I told him. "I'm buying his debt because I want to own it. From now on, Dwight Parker owes me, and he's going to pay every penny back with interest he can't imagine." I hung up and poured myself a glass of a local Pinot Noir. Something honest, something untampered. I sat on my porch and watched the sunrise, the orange light bleeding over the horizon. My phone started exploding with notifications the second the blog post went live. Comments were piling up, shares were hitting the hundreds, and the wine community was already demanding to know where the bottle had come from. I saw Dwight's car pull into my driveway at 8 a.m. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He stumbled out of the car, his phone in his hand, his face a mask of pure terror. He ran up the porch steps, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Dad, have you seen the internet? Someone's talking about the wine. They're saying it's a fake. They're saying it's dangerous." I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked him dead in the eye. "I know, Dwight," I said. "I'm the one who wrote it." Dwight froze, his foot halfway over the threshold. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sallow, sickly gray. He looked at the phone in his hand, then back at me, his mouth working but no sound coming out. I didn't get up. I didn't offer him a seat. I just sat there in the morning light, watching the realization hit him like a slow-motion car crash. "You," he finally whispered. "Why would you do that, Dad? It'll ruin us. The startup, the investors. Everyone will see this." "The startup is already dead, Dwight," I said, my voice as cold as a winter cellar. "And as for the investors, I think they'll be more concerned about the attempted murder of a family member than a few bad reviews." Dwight slumped against the doorframe, his knees giving way. He slid down the wood until he was sitting on the porch floor, his head in his hands. He started to sob, a high, thin sound that grated on my nerves. I felt a flicker of the old fatherly instinct to reach out, to tell him it would be okay. But I smothered it. That instinct was what had nearly gotten me poisoned. "We were desperate, Dad," he choked out. "Venera said it was the only way. She said you had so much and you'd never miss the money if we just made you feel like you needed us." Carter was going to break my legs, or worse. I leaned forward, my shadow falling over him. "So you decided to break my heart instead. You decided to turn my house into a crime scene." He looked up, his eyes red and streaming. "I didn't want to do it. I tried to tell her it was too much. But the debt. It just kept growing. I thought if I saved you, everything would go back to the way it was. You'd be proud of me for once. The hero son." I stood up, the movement sharp and decisive. I walked into the house and grabbed a manila folder from the dining room table. I tossed it onto the porch next to him. Inside were the loan transfer documents, the wire confirmation, and a new promissory note. "I bought your debt from Von Carter," I told him, "all $50,000 of it, plus the $10,000 I paid him to walk away." Dwight scrambled for the papers, his hands shaking so hard he nearly tore them. He stared at the numbers, his eyes wide. You paid it? I'm free?" "No," I said, the words snapping like a whip. "You're not free. You're under new management. From this moment on, you and Venera work for me. You will pay back every cent of that $60,000 at a 15% interest rate. I will take it directly from your salaries. And if you miss a single payment, or if I ever see a tampered bottle in this house again, I hand that digital recorder to the district attorney. Dwight looked at me with a mix of relief and profound fear. I saw the shift in his eyes the moment he realized his father wasn't a victim anymore. He was a creditor. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice small. "Now, you go find your wife," I said, "and you tell her that the family dinner is still on for Saturday night. We're going to have a little celebration. Gretel will be there, and I've invited a few other guests." The rest of the week was a blur of calculated moves. I contacted the local news station, a reporter I knew who specialized in consumer fraud. I told him I had a story about a massive counterfeit wine ring operating out of the suburbs. I didn't give him Dwight's name yet, but I gave him enough bait to ensure he'd show up on Saturday. I wanted the pressure to be public. I wanted the social cost to be as high as the financial one. My phone buzzed on Thursday afternoon. It was an email from an anonymous account, the same truth seeker who had sent me the first tip. "Piper Green is the one who made the poison," the email read. "Venera's brother. He's the one who researched the dosages. He's been blackmailing them for months. He's coming for his cut on Saturday. Be ready." I stared at the screen, a new layer of the betrayal peeling back. Venera's brother, Piper, was a failed chemistry student with a history of small-time fraud. It made sense. Venera didn't have the technical knowledge to formulate something that specific. She had been the executor, but her own flesh and blood had been the architect. And now, he was coming to collect. I called Felix, my neighbor and the retired detective. I told him I needed him in the kitchen on Saturday night with his service weapon and a pair of handcuffs. "This is getting dangerous, Harry," Felix said over the phone. "You're bringing a loan shark's victim, a poisoner, and a blackmailer into one room." "I know," I said, "but that's how you catch all the rats at once. You put the cheese in the middle of the floor and wait." Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, humid heat. I set the dining room table with the good china, the silver candlesticks, and a fresh, untampered bottle of 1990 Margaux. I wanted the contrast to be visible. I wanted them to see what they could have had if they had just been honest. Gretel arrived first, her face pale and drawn. She sat at the table like she was waiting for an execution. Dwight and Venera followed, walking like ghosts, their eyes darting to every corner of the room. They sat across from Gretel, the silence between them thick enough to choke on. The doorbell rang at 6:15. I opened it to find a man I hadn't seen in years, Piper Green. He was tall, thin, with a smirk that suggested he was the smartest person in the room. "Harrison, thanks for the invite," Piper said, stepping inside without waiting. "I hear we're discussing estate matters." I gestured to the table. "Sit down, Piper." We were just about to start. I stood at the head of the table, the candlelight flickering in the dark wine. I looked at each of them, my son, his wife, her mother, and the man who had cooked the poison. I felt a strange sense of peace. The trap was set, and the rats were all in the room. "I have something to show you all," I said, pulling out my phone and placing it in the center of the table. The screen lit up with a video file. It was a surveillance clip from the Greenwood Pharmacy, time-stamped Wednesday at 2 p.m. It showed Venera meeting Piper in the parking lot. She was crying, handing him a stack of cash, and he was handing her a small brown paper bag. "I know what's in the bag, Piper," I said, my voice steady. "It's the second dose, the one you told her to use because the first one failed." The room erupted. Venera let out a shriek that sounded like an animal in a trap, her chair clattering backward as she scrambled away from the table. Dwight lunged for the phone, his face a mask of panicked rage, but I slammed my hand down on the screen, pinning it to the wood. Piper didn't move. He just leaned back, his smirk widening into something jagged and ugly. "You've been busy, Harrison," Piper said, his voice smooth as silk. "But a video of a parking lot isn't a crime. People trade bags all the time." "Not when the bags contain arsenic trioxide and oleander extract," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "And not when the person receiving them has already been recorded confessing to an attempted poisoning." Piper's smirk flickered. He looked at Venera, who was huddling against the wall, her hands over her mouth. "You talked?" he hissed. "You stupid girl, you actually talked?" She recorded the call. "Piper," Venera sobbed. "He has everything. He knows about the debt. He knows about the lab." Dwight grabbed a steak knife from the table setting, the silver blade gleaming in the candlelight. He pointed it at Piper, his hand shaking so hard the tip of the knife danced in the air. "You did this," he screamed. "You told us it was safe. You said it would just make him sick enough to sign the papers. You're the one who's going to prison." Felix stepped out of the kitchen then, his service weapon drawn and held at a low ready. His presence was a physical weight in the room, the authority of 30 years on the force settling over the table. "Everyone freeze," he barked. "Put the knife down, Dwight." Dwight dropped the knife like it had turned into a coal. It hit the china plate with a loud ring, a sound that seemed to signal the end of the world. He slumped back into his chair, his head falling onto the table as he began to howl with grief. Felix moved toward Piper, who finally looked a little pale. "I have a tox report from a certified lab, Piper," Felix said, reaching for his handcuffs. "And I have a witness who saw you formulating the mixture in your garage. Your old roommate wasn't too happy about the smell. He was more than willing to trade your location for a clean record on his own charges." I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the wreckage of my family. Gretel was crying silently, her eyes fixed on her daughter with a look of pure, unadulterated heartbreak. Venera was a shell, her eyes hollowed out by fear. And my son was a broken man, a failure who had tried to murder his way into success. "Why?" I asked, the word echoing in the quiet room. "Why wouldn't you just come to me? I would have helped you with the debt. I would have found a way." Dwight looked up, his face smeared with tears. "Because you never looked at me like I was enough, Dad," he shouted. "It was always about the wine, the cellar, the legacy. I was just the kid who broke things. I wanted to be the one who saved something for once." The honesty of the statement hit me harder than the poison ever could. I looked at the bottles of wine surrounding us, the thousands of dollars of fermented juice that I had spent my life protecting. I had built a fortress of glass and cork, and I had left my son outside in the cold. It didn't excuse the murder attempt, but it explained the rot. I reached into the manila folder and pulled out the blog post I had written, the one that was currently circulating through every wine circle in the country. I slid it across the table toward Venera and Dwight. "Your names aren't in here yet," I said, "but they will be by tomorrow morning. I'm turning over the evidence to the district attorney. All of it." "Harrison, please," Venera begged, dropping to her knees. "I'm pregnant. You're going to be a grandfather. You can't send the mother of your grandchild to prison." The room went dead silent. I felt the air leave my lungs, a physical blow that made me stagger back against the sideboard. A grandchild, a new life starting in the middle of this graveyard. I looked at her stomach, then at Dwight, who was staring at his wife in shock. "Is it true?" Dwight whispered. Venera nodded, her face wet with tears. 8 weeks. I found out the day we brought the bottle. I thought we had to do it for the baby, to have a future." I closed my eyes, the weight of the choice pressing down on me. I could destroy them. I had the power, the evidence, and the right to do it. I could send them all to prison and spend the rest of my life in a quiet house with my dusty bottles. Or I could find another way to handle the debt and the crime. I looked at Felix. He was waiting for my word. He was my friend, but he was also a cop. If I told him to make the arrest, the cuffs would snap shut and the story would belong to the state. I took a deep breath, the scent of the 1990 Margot filling my senses. It was a beautiful wine, complex and aging with grace. It reminded me that some things are worth the work of saving, even when they're flawed. "Felix, give us a minute," I said, my voice raspy. "Harrison, you can't be serious," Felix said, his brow furrowed. "This is attempted murder." "I know what it is," I said, "but it's my family. Just give me 5 minutes." Felix sighed and stepped back into the kitchen, though he kept the door cracked. I looked at the three of them, the broken son, the desperate mother, and the blackmailer. "Here's how this is going to work," I said, my voice as hard as flint. Piper, you're leaving, now. You will sign a confession documenting your role in the formulation, and you will leave the state. If I ever hear your name or see your face again, I send the video and the confession to the police. You get nothing. No money, no leverage. You're a ghost. Piper looked at the gun in the kitchen and the coldness in my eyes. He stood up, grabbed a pen from the sideboard, and signed the paper I had already prepared. He didn't say a word as he walked out the door and into the night. Now, for you two, I said, turning to Dwight and Venera. You are going to sell the startup. You will move into the small apartment above my garage. You will work for me, tending the garden and managing the cellar until every penny of the $60,000 is paid back. You will attend counseling every single week, and you will never, ever lie to me again. But what about the baby? Venera whispered. The baby will grow up in this house, I said, with a grandfather who knows exactly who his parents are. And if you ever, for 1 second, think about taking a shortcut again, I will be the one who calls the police. You aren't getting away with this. You're living with the consequence. Dwight reached out and took Venera's hand. His shoulders slumped in defeat. They looked at each other, then at me. They had avoided prison, but they had lost their freedom. They were mine now. Gretel stood up and walked over to me, her hand resting on my shoulder. You're a better man than I would be, Harrison, she said softly. I'm not a better man, Gretel, I said, looking at the empty chair where Piper had sat. I'm just a man who knows the value of a long, slow aging process. Some things take years to turn into something good. I picked up the bottle of 1990 Margaux and poured 4 glasses. I handed one to Gretel, one to Dwight, and one to Venera. I raised my own glass, the dark liquid shimmering in the light. To the truth, I said, may we all learn to live with it. We drank in silence, the taste of the wine bitter and complex, a vintage that would stay with us for the rest of our lives. The front door clicked shut as Felix left, but as I set my glass down, I saw a final notification flash on my phone. It was a message from an unknown number, the same one that had been sending me tips. You think you won, Harrison? The message read. But you forgot one thing. Piper wasn't the only one Venera was paying. Check the nursery. The glass of 1990 Margaux slipped from my fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of deep garnet red. The text message on my screen glowed like a brand. Check the nursery. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I looked at Dwight and Venera. They were huddled together, seemingly broken, but the world was tilting again. I didn't wait for an explanation. I turned and ran toward the back of the house, my boots thudding on the floorboards. I burst into the room they had begun prepping for the baby, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls were a soft, innocent blue, but the air felt heavy with a chemical tang. I tore through the closet, my hands shaking as I knocked over stacks of folded onesies. Hidden behind a box of diapers was a second bottle. Not wine this time, but a heavy plastic jug of industrial-grade pesticide. My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. It wasn't just about the wine. They had turned the very sanctuary of their unborn child into a backup plan. Harrison? Dwight's voice came from the doorway, small and trembling. I spun around, holding the jug out like a piece of radioactive waste. What is this, Dwight? I roared, my voice cracking the silence of the nursery. What was the plan if I didn't drink the wine? Were you going to wait until I came in here to help you paint? Dwight collapsed against the door frame, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He looked at the jug, then at Venera, who had appeared behind him. She was white as a sheet, her hands moving protectively over her stomach in a gesture that now felt like a lie. The betrayal was a living thing in the room, suffocating and hot. I didn't know about that, Dwight sobbed, his head in his hands. I swear, Dad, I thought it was just the wine. You thought it was just the wine, I echoed, a cold, sharp laugh escaping my throat. I walked past them, the jug heavy in my hand, and headed straight for the wine cellar. I needed to see the full scope of the rot. I ignored their pleas as I descended the stairs, the cool air doing nothing to soothe the fire in my blood. Under the magnifying lamp, I began pulling every bottle I had touched since they arrived. My thumb found a creased capsule on a bottle of Chardonnay, then a Pinot, then my daily drinking water. She had poisoned my entire life, one seal at a time. The truth seeker hadn't just been a whistleblower, they were a witness to a systematic execution. I sat on my workbench, surrounded by enough toxins to kill a city block, and felt the final thread of my mercy snap. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the truth seeker back. It rang twice before Piper's voice answered, sounding entirely too amused for a man who had just been banished. "Found the nursery stash, did you?" Piper asked, a low chuckle vibrating through the line. Venera always was a perfectionist. She wanted to make sure that if the heart attack didn't take, a gas leak or an accidental ingestion would finish the job. "Why are you telling me this now?" I hissed, my knuckles white on the phone. "Because the debt transfer you signed didn't include my consulting fee, Harrison," Piper said, his tone turning sharp. "I want $10,000 in my account by dawn, or I call the news crew sitting on your lawn and tell them the hero father is actually harborers of attempted murderers." The world narrowed to a single burning point of focus. I had tried to play the role of the merciful patriarch, but I was dealing with a food chain of predators. I didn't respond to Piper. I hung up the phone and walked back upstairs, the weight of the evidence folder in my hand feeling like a weapon. Dwight and Venera were still in the hallway, looking like two children caught in a nightmare. I didn't look at them. I walked to the front door and threw it open, the humid Oregon night air rushing in. "Get out," I said, my voice a low, dangerous growl. "Dad, please," Dwight started, reaching for my arm. I shoved him back, the force of it surprising both of us. "I am not your father tonight. I am your victim. Take your things and leave. Now." I watched them stumble toward the garage, Venera's sobs echoing in the driveway. I stood on the porch until their taillights disappeared, my pulse finally slowing to a dull, heavy thud. I went back inside, locked every door, and sat at my desk. I didn't call my lawyer. I didn't call Felix. I opened my blog admin panel and began to type, my fingers flying with a clinical, vengeful precision. I wasn't going to wait for a quiet resolution anymore. If they wanted to burn my house down, I would give them the fire. I hit publish on the full story, names, dates, and the photo of the pesticide in the nursery, and watched the view count spin like a slot machine. My phone buzzed a minute later. It was a text from Dwight. "Dad, what have you done?" I didn't answer. I just watched the front gate on my security camera as the first news van began to turn into my street. The morning sun hit the news vans like spotlights, the chrome and satellite dishes gleaming on my front lawn. I watched them through the slats of the blinds, the world outside screaming for a story I was finally ready to tell. My phone was a constant vibration of demands, producers, reporters, and the frantic, incoherent text from Dwight. By 10 a.m., the story had reached CNN International. There was no going back to the quiet life of a sommelier. I stepped out onto the porch, the wall of cameras and microphones rising to meet me. I didn't have a statement prepared. I had the truth, and it was heavier than any vintage. My son and his wife tried to poison me for $180,000 in debt, I said, my voice carrying over the crowd with a clarity that surprised me. They used a 1995 Chateau Margaux as the delivery system. I'm here today because I trust my senses more than I trusted my own blood. The roar of questions that followed was a physical tide, but I ignored it. I walked down the steps and directly to the unmarked police cruiser that had just pulled up. Detective Morrison got out, looking tired but determined. "You're sure about this, Harrison?" he asked, gesturing to the crowd. "This ends their lives as they know them." "They ended our life as a family the second they bought the oleander," I replied, stepping into the back seat. The ride to the station was a montage of gray streets and silent realization. I spent the next 6 hours in an interrogation room, laying out the evidence like a tasting flight. I played the recording of Venera's scream. I showed the time-stamped photos of Dwight with Von Carter. I handed over the jug from the nursery. By the time I walked out, the warrants had already been signed. I went to Gretel's house first. I found her in the kitchen, staring at a half-full cup of tea, the television muted in the corner showing her daughter's face in a mugshot. "I had to do it, Gretel," I said softly, sitting across from her. I know, she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. But Harrison, the baby, what happens to the baby? I didn't have an answer for that, so I did the only thing I could. I wrote her a check for $10,000. For the lawyers, for the baby, for whatever comes next, I told her. I spent the next week in a legal fog, a 2-4-line montage of affidavits and grand jury testimony. I saw Dwight and Venera only once, across a courtroom during their arraignment. They looked small, stripped of their startup dreams and their expensive clothes, wearing the orange jumpsuits of the state. Venera's hand was still on her stomach, a constant reminder of the innocent collateral damage. Piper Green was arrested 2 days later at a motel near the border. He tried to bargain with my voice DNA recordings, but Felix had already secured the roommate's testimony. The blackmailer was finally in a cage of his own making. I returned home to a house that felt too large and too quiet. The garden was growing wild, the tomatoes overripe and rotting on the vine. I stood at the top of the cellar stairs, my hand on the doorknob, but I couldn't go down. Every bottle in that room was a memory of a son who was gone. My phone buzzed. A message from Harold in Germany. I'm on the plane. I'll be there by morning. We'll handle the harvest together. I walked onto the back porch and looked out at the sunset. The victory felt like ashes in my mouth, but the truth was finally out in the light. The front gate buzzed. It was a delivery, a certified letter from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center. I tore it open, my breath catching in my throat. The letter from Venera was a plea written in a jagged, desperate script. She talked about the prison medical unit, about giving birth in chains, and about the 18 months she would be allowed to keep the child before the state took them away. Please don't let them grow up thinking their grandfather hated them before they were even born, she wrote. I set the letter on the kitchen table and looked at Harold, who was sitting across from me, his face tan from the German sun and lined with a grief he hadn't earned. He had arrived that morning, bringing the smell of rain and fresh soil into my stagnant house. "What are you going to do, Dad?" Harold asked, his eyes moving to the prison envelope. "I don't know," I said, and for the first time in my life, the lack of an answer didn't feel like a failure. I've spent 35 years knowing exactly what to do with a bottle. This doesn't have a label. The doorbell rang, a sharp sensory jolt that made us both flinch. It was Felix carrying a manila folder that looked heavier than the last. "Von Carter's operation was raided this morning," Felix said, stepping into the kitchen. "They found more than just Dwight's debt. They found a ledger of everyone Piper had been consulting for. It's a bigger ring than we thought, Harry. The news should have felt like another win, another point for justice. But all I could think about was the child who would be born in 6 months. The legal justice was unfolding in a 2-4-line montage of arrests and headlines, but the private cost was still accruing. "I need to see him," I said suddenly, standing up so fast my chair scraped the floor. "Dwight?" Harold asked. I didn't answer. I grabbed my keys and headed for the car. The drive to the county jail was a blur of gray concrete and high fences. I sat in the glass-walled visiting room, my hands clasped on the cold metal table. When Dwight walked in, his orange jumpsuit looked 3 sizes too big. He looked at the floor, his shoulders hunched, until he finally sat across from me. "I got your letter," I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, not looking up. "I know it doesn't mean anything. It means everything and nothing at the same time," I replied. "I'm here because of the baby," Venera wrote to me. Dwight's head snapped up, his eyes wide and wet. Are you going to help?" "I am going to make sure that child has a life," I said, my voice hardening. "But you and Venera, you are going to serve every day of your sentence. You are going to pay back every penny of that debt. And when you get out, you are going to spend the rest of your lives earning the right to be called parents." Dwight nodded, a single sob escaping him as he pressed his forehead against the glass. I stood up, the movement sharp and decisive. I didn't look back as the guard led him away. I drove home and found Gretel in my garden, pulling the weeds that had begun to choke the tomatoes. She looked up as I approached, her face tired but hopeful. "I'm going to build a nursery," I told her. Not in their apartment, in the main house, the one my wife picked out. Gretel stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I'll help you paint," she said. We spent the afternoon in the room that had once held the pesticide, scrubbing the walls until the scent of chemicals was gone, replaced by the smell of soap and fresh water. Harold joined us, moving the heavy furniture with a quiet efficiency. It was a family working together, but the missing pieces were a physical ache. As the sun began to set, I went down to the wine cellar for the first time in weeks. I didn't look at the Chateau Margaux. I walked to the very back, to the rack of bottles I had saved for the most important moments of my life. I pulled a bottle of 1990 Margaux, the twin to the one we had opened before the world fell apart. I brought it upstairs and set it on the table. "Tonight, we don't drink for justice," I said to Harold and Gretel. "We drink for the one who isn't here yet." I uncorked the bottle, the sound a clean, resonant pop in the quiet kitchen. I poured 3 glasses, the liquid shimmering like a promise. "To the future," I said, raising my glass. We drank, and for the first time, the wine didn't taste like ashes. It tasted like survival. My phone buzzed on the counter, a notification from my blog. The view count was over 1 million, but I didn't open the app. I didn't need the world to watch anymore. I had my house, I had my friends, and in 6 months, I would have my grandchild. The February air in Oregon was a biting, crystalline cold as I sat in the hospital waiting room. The fluorescent lights hummed with a clinical indifference, a sharp contrast to the storm of nerves in my chest. I wasn't in a private suite or a luxury birthing center. I was in the secured wing of the county hospital, guarded by a deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Detective Morrison walked through the double doors, 2 coffees in his hand. He handed one to me without a word, the heat seeping into my frozen fingers. "She's in recovery," Morrison said, his voice low. It was a girl, healthy, 7 pounds. I felt the air leave my lungs, a physical release that made my shoulders drop. A girl, a granddaughter. "Can I see her?" I asked. The deputy nodded to Morrison, and I was led down a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. The room was small, stripped of the usual flowers and balloons. Venera lay in the bed, her face pale and exhausted, her wrist tethered to the bed rail by a thin steel chain. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and fearful. She didn't say a word, just shifted the bundle in her arms. I walked to the side of the bed, my heart thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked down at the tiny wrinkled face of my granddaughter. She was perfect, innocent of the debts and the poisons and the orange jumpsuits. "Her name is Sarah," Venera whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "After your wife." The tears came then, hot and sudden, blurring the sight of the child. I reached out and touched a tiny velvet hand with my fingertip. Sarah, my wife, would have loved her with a ferocity that could move mountains. "I'll take her, Harrison," Venera said, a sob breaking her voice. "After the 18 months, I want her to grow up in your house, not a foster home, please." I looked at the woman who had tried to kill me, and for the first time, I didn't see the predator. I saw a mother who had finally realized the price of her choices. "She will grow up with me," I promised, my voice steady, "and she will know her parents. But she will know the truth, Venera, all of it." Venera nodded, her head falling back against the pillow as she began to cry silently. I stayed for an hour, holding the baby while the deputy watched from the door. When I finally walked out, the cold air of the parking lot felt like a clean slate. I drove home and found Harold and Gretel waiting on the porch. The nursery was ready, the crib assembled, the walls painted a soft, hopeful cream. Is she okay?" Gretel asked, her hands twisting in her lap. "She's perfect," I said, and I felt a weight lift that I had been carrying since that first bottle of Margaux. Harold walked to the kitchen and returned with a bottle of wine. It wasn't an $800 vintage. It was a simple, local sparkling wine from the vineyard next to his in Germany. "To Sarah," Harold said, his eyes meeting mine. "To Sarah," we echoed. We drank, and the wine tasted like new beginnings. The next day, I went down to the wine cellar. I walked to the workbench and picked up the evidence folder. I looked at the lab reports, the photos, and the recording device. I walked to the incinerator in the corner of the room and threw them in one by one until the fire had consumed the last of the betrayal. I didn't need the evidence anymore. The justice had been served, the debts were being paid, and the future was sleeping in a hospital cradle. I walked back upstairs and opened the cellar door, leaving it wide to the rest of the house. I sat in my garden, the winter sun pale but persistent, and began to write a response to Dwight's latest letter. "I am a grandfather now," I wrote, my pen steady on the paper. "And for her sake, we will find a way to be a family again. It will take time. It will take years of aging, but we will start today." The garden was still wild, but the first crocuses were beginning to push through the cold earth. I sat in the sun, a grandfather and a survivor, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't wonder if it was worth it. I knew it was. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.